Hi there! In today's episode of Cool Ideas, we're going to be talking about directed panspermia. That's right, panspermia, the theory put forth by Francis Crick, one of the guys who discovered the double helix shape of the DNA molecule while taking LSD. Alright, so what exactly is directed panspermia? Well, it's quite complicated, but the very short version is that Francis Crick did not believe that the modern DNA molecule that all life forms on Earth share, from bacteria to human beings, it did not have enough time to simply come together randomly out of the primordial ooze as the current scientific consensus thinks. It's possible that could happen, but it would theoretically take billions of years, whereas on Earth, there wasn't that much time. There was only about 100 million years between when Earth was capable of supporting life and when we see tons of bacteria all over the world. So what he thought happened, some ancient alien civilization on another planet somewhere, they were facing some kind of global catastrophe, and what they did is that they put a bunch of frozen bacteria onto rockets, shot it out into space, and one of those, rockets or asteroids or whatever they used, crash landed onto Earth 3.9 billion years ago. The bacteria started to spread and mutate, and eventually here we are today. That's the idea of directed panspermia. Sounds pretty out there, but remember, Francis Crick, we're talking about a Nobel Prize winning scientist who discovered the double helix shape of DNA. But the cool thing about directed panspermia is you can also link it, or at least Graham Hancock did in a very cool lecture that I listened to. He also wrote about it in a book called Supernatural, which I have not read yet, but I will, and that'll be part 2 of this video when I have more of an idea what I'm talking about. In Graham Hancock's lecture, he links the theory of directed panspermia to the other theory that the way in which human beings gained consciousness as we think of it today, that began when human beings first took psychedelics, probably unwittingly. They ate some plant that had psychedelic properties, and that's what kind of opened the doorway to think in the conscious way that we think of today that separates us from other animals. You can basically just think the giant black obelisk in 2001: A Space Odyssey equals a giant magic mushroom. That's essentially how we made that leap between primate, who just kind of runs around in the wild, to these weird creatures that build giant cities and rocket ships and stuff like that. Let's rewind the clock real fast to 6 million years ago. That's when the very first human ancestors showed up on Earth. Now, these were not, modern anatomical humans. They were just great apes, like chimpanzee looking guys. Then over the next several million years, they evolved to look more and more like humans, but they don't really do anything interesting. They don't show any proof of having essentially a mind, a conscious mind that thinks abstractly. They just live like great apes, no different than a group of gorillas or chimpanzees might in the wild. Then at about 2 million years ago, they make their very first stone tool. These were called the Aldewan, which, fun fact, is where they got the term Alderaan for Star Wars. I'm just kidding, I made that up. It's possible George Lucas was doing some anthropological research one day and he was like, hey, Alderaan? Maybe. Back to the subject at hand. After the Aldewan started making their crude stone tools, once again, they didn't really do anything again. Then we get to about 300 to 200,000 years ago, which is when we start to see modern anatomical humans arrive on Earth. But once again, these modern anatomical humans that look just like us today, they didn't really do anything interesting for another at least 100,000 years, possibly even 200,000 years. Then it's at about 35,000 years ago that we start to see the really interesting cave paintings. And the reason why they're so interesting is because they're ridiculously abstract. They don't just show everyday items like you paint like a crude buffalo or a horse or a human being. Instead, it looks like something from the mind of Pablo Picasso. You have like animal heads on human bodies, what's called a therianthrope. There's some cave art that shows like a man with a buffalo's head and he's straddling a woman, but the woman doesn't have a head, but then a lion's head is like growing out of one of her arms. Like really weird, trippy stuff. Like somebody took some magic mushrooms by accident, he was hungry, and he saw some mushrooms, he gobbled them up, and then started seeing some weird stuff, and then he painted it on the wall, and essentially gained the idea to think abstractly, and that's where people gained consciousness in the way that we think of it today. Now let's fast forward to modern day times where we have Dr. Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix of the DNA molecule while taking LSD. But it wasn't like he just took LSD on the weekends, but then when he was sober, he came up with the double helix. No, he was on LSD envisioned the double helix, and then when he was sober probably wrote it all down. Okay, so let's talk about DNA really fast. It's actually quite fascinating. Now, in order to do so, I've set up a few little props here on the workbench, so let's check that out. What we have here are 4 different colored lollipops. You'll notice that we have the blue, the red, the yellow, and the green. Those 4 different colors represent adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. I could be mispronouncing those words, but who cares? You can look it up. So right now it's in the order of red, blue, green, yellow, right? But when you switch around the order of it, if it's like blue, red, green, yellow, then that creates a different code for something else. And this different order is the difference between, let's say, a human being and a beaver splashing around in the stream. That was genius setting up the lollipops like that, wasn't it? It really helped you visualize the DNA, I can tell. But you get the idea that that's essentially like a computer code, and based on the different order that you have, you can create the difference between an Adonis, like this, or you can have a silly beaver in the stream. We share the same DNA, and it just depends on what order the lollipops are in, and that creates the difference between you, me, and the beaver. So, conventional science says that essentially there was just a primordial soup in the earliest days of Earth, right? There was lava shooting all over the place, crazy weather, but that doesn't seem very plausible because Earth was originally formed about 4.5 billion years ago, but it didn't cool off until about 3.9 million years ago, when at least theoretically it could have had some sort of life on it. And then at 3.8 billion years ago, so only 100 million years later, we have bacteria all over the planet, right? So the idea that the DNA could have formed out of just random molecules colliding in a primordial soup and making something as complex as DNA, there was one astrophysicist named Fred Hoyle. Well, I'm pretty sure that's what his name was. I don't know who he is. And he said that the odds of DNA just forming randomly out of this primordial soup, whatever that really means, is about the same as a Boeing 767 just forming randomly after a hurricane passes over a junkyard. You would need billions of years for the odds to become even remotely plausible that you would have something like that happen, to have DNA just form randomly. It wouldn't only take 100 million years, or at least it's very unlikely that it would occur in such a short, time frame. If you had maybe a few billion years, like you might have had on another planet, then it might have actually happened, and then you could have had this really advanced civilization. Now, Francis Crick's theory with Panspermia is that, they were facing some kind of global catastrophe, and therefore they sent out this bacteria all throughout space to sort of keep something of their civilization alive. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But the DNA that all life shares on planet Earth actually comes from out there. It's like in Battlestar Galactica, right? Life here began out there. So that's the idea of directed panspermia. But wait, it actually gets even more interesting. You see, thanks to the Human Genome Project, we know quite a bit about DNA. And as it turns out, only about 3% of the DNA molecule is used to encode life forms. So the part of the DNA that's the code between me and, the antelope, that's only 3% of the DNA molecule, the part that encodes life. And obviously there's a tremendous amount of information held on just that 3%. The rest of the DNA molecule, which is 97% of the DNA molecule, i.e., virtually all of it, in conventional science is just called junk DNA. They don't know what it's used for, they don't care, it's just junk. Which sounds extremely stupid to me. Why is it that only 3% of the DNA molecule is used to actually create life forms like human beings, antelope, beavers, ducks, all of it, insects as well? I don't like insects, but nevertheless, unfortunately, they have the same DNA that we do. All that life on planet Earth only uses 3% of that DNA molecule. What in the world is the remaining 97% of it being used for? And nobody really knows. But there's a very interesting theory that I believe some researchers at Boston University came up with maybe a couple of decades ago, and it involves this linguistic law that I cannot pronounce. It is spelled ZIPFS, right? So ZIPFS. So using this particular linguistic law that shall not be named, they determined that the 97% junk DNA actually uses the same structure that a language uses. What the linguistic law that shall not be named talks about, it determined a way to figure out if something was just alphabet soup or had the structure of a language. And all human languages will fall under the rubric of this particular linguistic law. And so if you just make up a bunch of random words and letters that aren't actually a language, the linguistic law that shall not be named will tell you that that's just alphabet soup and nonsense. But if it's a real language, it will tell you if it is. And these researchers at Boston University were able to apply that law to the junk DNA, that 97% of it, and it has the same structure as a language. Pretty freaking wild. So, what if that 97% of DNA is a message? What if it's the entire recorded history and wisdom of the ancient civilization that originally seeded Earth? If the theory of directed panspermia is correct in some way, shape, or form, that the DNA on Earth actually came from some alien planet, God knows how many billion years ago, it's possible that that alien race, which would have really advanced technologies, encoded their entire history of their entire civilization and all the wisdom and technology and everything else that they had acquired. Maybe they encoded that into the DNA that they shot out into space. And when their little capsule landed on Earth, it was probably on an asteroid or a comet or something like that. When it crashed into Earth and the bacteria started to multiply, and then they knew that over time, over the next, billion years, then it would start to evolve into life forms, and eventually one of those life forms would be capable of eating one of the other life forms that would contain psychedelic properties that would then allow that life form to become conscious and eventually start to do science and understand DNA and eventually decode the message that was encoded onto that DNA in the first place by the crazy aliens from several billion years ago. Pretty freaking cool theory. So the idea is that when you're taking mushrooms or any other psychedelic, especially the dimethyltryptamine, otherwise known as DMT, that's in ayahuasca that makes you hallucinate in a really cool way, when you're taking that kind of a substance, what you're doing is you're actually accessing that encoded information on your DNA that's talking about the wisdom and history, etc., of that ancient alien civilization. So you will never look at taking psychedelics in quite the same way again. Now, once again, this is just a theory. No one can prove it's true, but it's a pretty freaking cool theory. So to recap this entire thing, several billion years ago, you have an ancient alien race that developed on some planet a zillion light years away, probably within this galaxy. For whatever reason, they decided to seed other planets with the DNA molecule, which they probably put in the form of bacteria. They froze it and they shot it out into space, probably on asteroids, comets, something like that. They looked at Goldilocks planets throughout the galaxy and they knew which ones would be capable of supporting life. And so they fired their asteroid at that planet, knowing that it would crash there and that the bacteria would erupt and eventually start to create all kinds of crazy life. Then, so at around 3.9 billion years ago, that asteroid hits Earth, the bacteria start to multiply and eventually start to evolve. They start to create different types of life forms. You get the dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff. So of course, one of the life forms that it created is human beings, like this one right here. And then the other ones that it formed are the various plants that have psychedelic properties. Then they knew that full well that eventually this crazy life form right here would eat some of those psychedelics and then gain access to a higher level of consciousness, allowing it to think abstractly and create more and more advanced tools until eventually it would start to create science and it would start to understand DNA, until eventually it would look at that 97% of the junk DNA and realize that it was a language, and then eventually decode that language, and it would learn the history of where it truly came from, and it would learn the history of this ancient alien race, which is very likely extinct now. Now, of course, you see this story in all kinds of books, movies, video games, especially video games like StarCraft 2, for example. There's like a super race in the beginning that seeded life throughout the rest of the galaxy or the universe or wherever else. But nevertheless, you see that story a lot. That's a pretty freaking cool story. And the fact that you actually have some degree of scientific evidence to support that theory. And so maybe it's possible that in order to explore outer space, instead of building crazy SpaceX rockets that can fly up and then land, which admittedly is very, very cool, but what you should be doing instead is taking mushrooms. There's other theories about what psychedelics are. Are they actually opening up a doorway to parallel dimensions and that kind of thing? Certainly possible. Ancient peoples always thought that they were looking at spirit worlds and that kind of thing, but nowadays with things like string theory, we're going to be talking about like, oh, it's another parallel dimension. Listen to Alex Jones, he's going to tell you all about the machine elves and how there in fact are government programs that are very similar to what you saw in the first season of Stranger Things. I stopped watching that show because I deemed it to be too scary. I'm a wuss, what can I say? But nevertheless, it's the same idea where you have a very controlled government program where you're actually taking these sort of astronauts, so to speak, and you're giving them these sort of really intense psychedelics under controlled circumstances, and then you send them into essentially another realm to make contact with what are possibly alien races of, interdimensional beings. But you also hear similar tales in all sorts of ancient folklore, whether it's the Native American tribes or, of course, the jinn and Arabian folklore, right? There's this parallel reality of fire beings called the jinn that exist right here on Earth, but we just can't see them, and then you have to do all kinds of devil worship stuff in order to summon a jinn into this world, that kind of thing, and it's really scary and crazy. But read some H.P. Lovecraft, it's great stuff. But the point of all this is, there's some wild stuff. It's some really, really wild stuff, and there actually is some scientific basis to it, and I guess I would just say it's worth exploring. So that's the theory of directed panspermia, meshed with some of the theories about psychedelics and consciousness. And when you sort of blend it all together and you think about the alien races and the language that you find encoded in the 97% junk DNA, pretty freaking wild stuff. And these could be massive discoveries if they were explored further. So that's all I've got to say, and I'm gonna sign off now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next one. And until then, you take care of yourself.